is not the president, has no power to call in the National Guard in November. His comments, they are part of a pattern, the latest in a long series of unprecedented, norm-busting statements that happen all too often to ignore. Susan Glasser from The New Yorker put it, quote, "The enemy within, straight-up language of dictators and tyrants who want to use the military on their own people." And if it couldn't be any clearer that he was referring to his critics and political opponents as the enemy from within, here's Trump from that same interview just a few minutes later.
And the enemy from within, in my opinion, is more dangerous than China, Russia, and all these countries, because if you have a smart president, he can handle them pretty easily. I got along great with all. I handled them. But the thing that's tougher to handle are these lunatics that we have inside, like Adam Schiff.
It is the kind of rhetoric that led one person to describe Trump as, quote, fascist to the core. That person, not a scholar or a democracy activist or a political opponent. It is someone who served under Trump. Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley. In an upcoming book by journalist Bob Woodward, Milley says, quote, "No one has ever been as dangerous to this country as Donald Trump. Now, I realize he's a total fascist. He's the most dangerous person to this country." Here's what former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney had to say about that on Meet the Press.
Like Mark Milley comes to mind, who,
right,
according to Bob Woodward's new book, War, called him a fascist. Would you go that far as to call him a
fascist? Look, I have tremendous respect for General Milley, and I see no reason to disagree with that assessment.
And that is where we start today with retired U.S. Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Amy McGrath. She is the founder of the Democratic Majority Action PAC. Also, MSNBC columnist and contributor Charlie Sykes is here. And with me at the table, MSNBC Justice and Legal Affairs analyst and former senior advisor to A.G. Garland, Anthony Nicolle. Thank you all so much for being with us. Amy, let's start with you on Milley's comments. A military man, he is used to making sober, rational, calculated decisions. When he says things like Donald Trump is the most dangerous person to this country, that sounds to me like a threat assessment.
Absolutely. And it's also unprecedented. I mean, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this is the #1 ranking military officer in our nation, somebody who was very close to Trump, who was his hand-picked advisor. To say that, it just shows you how we're living in extraordinary times. And I think, normally with Trump's rhetoric, we see it a lot, and we sort of become numb to it, right, in our country. This type of rhetoric is very, very dangerous, and it goes against almost 250 years of tradition and trust that we have in our military. Look, in the United States of America, we do not use our military against our own people. And for Donald Trump or any candidate for president to even suggest that is a very scary, dark place that he wants to take our country. And that's why General Milley is saying he's the most dangerous person that he knows to our country right now.
Amy, if Milley really thinks that Donald Trump is a dangerous fascist, a threat to this country, does he have an obligation to speak out, to say that more publicly in more public platforms?
You know what? I think he has. Would I like him to be even more public? Yes. You know who I would like to be even more public than General Milley? Because General Milley wore the uniform, and there's a deep tradition of being nonpartisan. I would like those political appointees who happen to be former generals who were in Trump's administration, like Secretary of Defense Mattis, his Chief of Staff, John Kelly. Those men need to come forward and tell us what they saw and heard. And also, we should note that his former Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, has said that Donald Trump tried to use the military against peaceful protesters, saying, hey, why can't you just shoot them? And that's one of the reasons why he is saying Trump is unfit for office. So a lot of them have come forward already.
So, Charlie, for those who have not come forward as publicly as some of us might have liked, you have the vice president invoking Milley in her remarks at Greenville, North Carolina. Take a listen.
Anybody who wants to be president of the United States, who has called for the, quote, termination of the Constitution of the United States, should never again have the ability to stand behind the seal of the President of the United States. And the people who know him best know it. His former national security advisor, 2 of his former defense secretaries, his former chief of staff in the White House, his own vice president have all warned America Donald Trump is unfit to serve. Or just listen most recently to what we heard General Milley said. General Milley, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs under Donald Trump, it was just reported, he said, quote, "No one has ever been as dangerous to this country," in referring to Donald Trump. Think about that. Think about that.
You got to admit, Charlie, that no matter how many times you tick through that list of folks who have come out and spoken out against him, tried to warn America, even when there are new additions to that list, it is equally alarming every time, equally stunning.
It is, and it's a hell of a closing argument for the vice president to make. The people closest to Donald Trump have said that he's unfit for office, and absolutely they need to speak out right now. If, in fact, this is a threat to the country, if, in fact, this is an emergency, I think this is what patriots do. They put country over party. You know, and to your earlier point, look, this is the reddest of red lines, using the military against other Americans, but it is an obsession of Donald Trump. He has said it over and over again. He's mused about using the Insurrection Act. He's talked about firing generals and putting MAGA-friendly officers in their place. And Liz Cheney has been concerned about this from the beginning. You might recall that in the days leading up to January 6th, she and her father were instrumental in getting every single living former Secretary of Defense to sign an open letter saying that the military had no role to play in American elections. That was an amazing moment, but it was also an indication of how alarmed they had to be that they thought that they had to write that letter. So this is not something that is just a one-off or a gaffe by Donald Trump. This is something that he has thought about, talked about over and over again. As you said, there's a real pattern here.
Right. I agree with what Charlie is saying. This was clearly something that he thought about. Just the fact that he ticks through all of the other places, people, things he is positioned as threats. China, Russia, migrants, which we know is a sort of favorite go-to threat, and then says, forget all of those. The greatest threat that actually faces this country is the, quote, enemy from in. There's the moment he says that. There's then what happens after.
Right. So about these Milley remarks, it was so important, Alicia, that the vice president doubled down and reiterated these remarks yesterday in Eastern North Carolina. Now I'm from Eastern North Carolina. For folks who may not be familiar with that part of the country, extremely conservative, very strong military presence. So when somebody like General Milley, when he says things like this, I mean, it's resonant with all of us as Americans, but is particularly resonant with people who put country over party. I'm talking Nikki Haley voters. Now, the other thing that struck me, and you opened here with this report, Donald Trump talking about the radical left. What struck me the most about this entire situation is what happened afterwards, Alicia. The Washington Post reached out to the Trump campaign and asked for clarification. But the Trump campaign, they didn't clarify, they doubled down. They equated efforts from the left, Alicia, to what we saw, to the arrest of an Afghan terrorist last week in Oklahoma. Do you remember this story? This was a man who had served as a security guard for the CIA in Afghanistan. He came to the United States on a humanitarian parole. The FBI is investigating whether or not, when he was radicalized, he was arrested just days ago for purchasing 2 AK-47s, among other weapons. And this is the person that the Trump campaign is likening to Trump's political enemies.
Well, it gets to the point, Charlie, this is clearly something that they have calculated. This is not an accident. It is not a gaffe. Is that just about the chaos, or is it about something else?
You know, it's very interesting when you think about the rhetoric of the last week or so that Donald Trump has calculated. He believes that all of the racism, the lies, the fascist adjacent rhetoric, if it's not even adjacent, that this works for him. That by turning Americans against one another, by making us fear other Americans more than any other threat, that somehow this is going to redound to his benefit. And so this is, again, I think one of the overriding questions in this election. Is he right? You know, is he seeing is he picking up in the polls when he lies about Haitian immigrants, when he lies about the immigrants in Aurora, when he talks about using the military against fellow Americans? Is there a large enough segment of the electorate, at least of his base, that is aroused by that, that in fact it will help him? Because he clearly believes that it's working for him right now.
I want you, Amy, to listen to two pieces of sound. The first is Liz Cheney, something she said yesterday on Meet the Press. And I want you to listen, and then I will read to you some of what Donald Trump has said about how he wants to use the military. Let's play that sound, and then we'll talk on the other side.
You know, I think people really need to look very carefully at what Donald Trump will do if he were ever to be in the Oval Office again. The extent to which that, you know, and he has said repeatedly that, you know, he believes he will be immune. Certainly the Supreme Court ruling, whatever they thought they were doing, Donald Trump believes he will be immune for anything he does once he's in office. He will not respect the rulings of our courts. And people have to realize our courts can't enforce their own rulings. So if a president refuses to carry out his obligation to do so, then we are no longer a nation of laws. Donald Trump will ignore Congress. He will appoint people like Mike Flynn, for example, who just, you know, 36 hours ago, Mike Flynn was at an event where he was asked whether or not the president's opponents should be executed. And he basically said, listen, yes, I'm going to unleash the gates of hell. These are the kinds of people that Donald Trump will be putting in place. The people that stopped him from his worst desires last time around won't serve again.
So, Amy, I want you to take that and put it side by side with this reporting from the AP about Donald Trump's plans for the military if he were to be reelected. Quote, he has pledged to recall thousands of American troops from overseas and station them at the U.S. border with Mexico. He's explored using troops for domestic policy priorities such as deportations and confronting civil unrest. He has talked of weeding out military officers who are ideologically opposed to him. When you take those two pieces, what we just heard from former Congresswoman Cheney, that reporting from the AP, you put them side by side. What does that tell you about a second Trump term?
Well, I think it's important to know, first of all, I agree with Liz Cheney 100%. We did a number of national security experts, leaders, including many former admirals and generals in the spring and the summer did what are called war games, democracy exercises, what have you, looking at Trump's rhetoric, looking at his plans and playing through scenarios and trying to figure out, could he actually do some of these things? And what we found was very sobering in that he could. The president has broad powers when it comes to domestic use of the military. And unfortunately, a lot of that is because in our country, the laws surrounding that are mostly procedural. We have traditions in this country, and he doesn't care about traditions. But it would be so dangerous because it would rip the fabric of our military in